Imagine you're an elite commando, right? You've spent months training. I mean, training to the point of absolute crushing physical and mental exhaustion for a mission so highly classified that you don't even know what country you're deploying to.
Right, you're just completely in the dark.
Exactly. And then you finally get the briefing. You find out you're going to infiltrate the most heavily defended, radar-saturated airspace on the planet.
Which is terrifying enough on its own.
Right. But here is the kicker. The very first step of your flawless, meticulously rehearsed tactical plan, the action that actually kicks off the entire assault, is to take a multi-million-dollar search and rescue helicopter, fly it into a heavily armed enemy fortress, and just purposefully crash it into a brick courtyard.
Yeah, you're literally going to ride a localized metallic earthquake right into a gunfight.
It's unbelievable.
It sounds like tactical suicide, honestly. I mean, the deliberate destruction of your primary insertion vehicle is something you almost never, ever see in modern operational planning.
Yeah, it goes against everything, right?
Completely. It violates every doctrine of aviation safety and asset preservation you can think of. And yet, this wasn't some wild act of desperation. It was a calculated mathematical choice driven by the unforgiving geometry of the target.
And the desperate necessity of the mission itself.
Exactly.
Well, that is the ultimate historical paradox we're unpacking today. We're looking at the Son Tay Raid, which was executed deep inside North Vietnam on November 20th, 1970.
A truly legendary operation.
It is. And I want to establish right out of the gate that the granular analysis, the tactical reconstructions, and all the on-ground intelligence we're diving into today come directly from a phenomenal, deeply researched study by military historian Mick Brichter.
Oh, his work is incredible.
Yeah, it's available over at battlefieldtravels.com. Brichter's work is definitive here. I mean, he leverages primary source documents, extensive GIS terrain analysis, and firsthand exploration of the actual Son Tay battlefield.
Which he actually visited, right?
Yeah, during a site visit in 2025.
Yeah.
So he reconstructs exactly what happened in the dark that night.
And, you know, Brichter's scholarship is absolutely essential here because the Son Tay Raid requires that level of forensic analysis. It is universally recognized as a masterclass in joint operation tactical execution.
Right, the mechanics of it.
Exactly. The infiltration, the assault, the extraction, they were executed with terrifying precision under just unimaginable pressure. Yet, as a strategic endeavor, it entirely failed its primary objective.
So it's a flawless failure.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. A flawless failure.
Okay, let's unpack this paradox.
Yeah.
To understand why an operation of this magnitude was even launched, you have to put yourself in the context of the Vietnam War in the late fall of 1970.
Right, because this isn't the early escalation phase anymore.
No, not at all. This is a grueling, grinding conflict, and the United States military is bleeding from a deeply psychological wound, which is the American prisoners of war.
Yeah, hundreds of American aviators and soldiers had been captured by this point, and the North Vietnamese held them in conditions specifically designed to break the human spirit.
We're talking systemic torture, right?
Systemic torture, severe malnutrition, complete medical neglect, and just years of solitary confinement. The U.S. intelligence apparatus knew these camps existed across North Vietnam, obviously.
But knowing they exist and finding them are two very different things.
Exactly. Pinpointing actionable, real-time intelligence on specific prisoners in specific cells was incredibly difficult. I mean, the North Vietnamese went to great length to camouflage these facilities.
And they heavily restricted the movement of the prisoners, too.
Right.
So the intelligence community is staring at this massive geographical expanse, just trying to find these highly concealed targets. And the breakthrough, the actual spark that ignites this entire operation, comes in May of 1970.
And it is such a wild story.
It really is. It involves this incredible intersection of orbital-level technology and desperate, on-the-ground human ingenuity.
Yeah, it all centered on a compound located just 23 miles west of Hanoi. So we are talking about a target deep inside fiercely defended enemy territory.
Way beyond the reach of standard search and rescue assets.
Far beyond. The confirmation of this specific camp came from overhead imagery captured by SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance flights.
Okay, we have to pause on the SR-71 for a second, because the capability of that aircraft in 1970 is just staggering.
It really is science fiction for the era.
Right. It's flying at the edge of the stratosphere, roughly 80,000 feet up, pushing Mach 3. It is literally moving faster than a rifle bullet.
It is. But the optical resolution of the camera packages carried by the Blackbird, specifically the technical objective cameras, was sophisticated enough that photo interpreters back in Washington could analyze the shadows and shapes in the dirt from that high up.
Which is mind-blowing. And what do they see?
But what they saw in the Son Tay compound were distinct visual cues. The prisoners, operating under the constant gaze of armed guards, were literally using their laundry, arranging their clothing in the dirt of the courtyard to spell out POW and other specific search and rescue evasion codes.
Oh, wow. They are sending distress signals to the edge of space with wet shirts.
Yeah, exactly.
The discipline required to coordinate that, knowing the fatal consequences if a guard realized what they were actually doing, is hard to even comprehend.
It shows incredible resilience.
So the National Photographic Interpretation Center processes these images. They verify the signals. They have a target. But looking at the military architecture of 1970, there's a massive bureaucratic hurdle to actually launching a rescue.
Right, a huge one. There is no Joint Special Operations Command.
No JSOC. That is the foundational challenge of this entire narrative.
Today, if the National Command Authority needs to execute a hostage rescue, JSOC provides the standing, dedicated architecture. You have operators from the Army, aviation assets from the Air Force, and intelligence cells who all train together year-round.
Right, they are a cohesive unit.
But in 1970, that connective tissue just did not exist. The U.S. military was rigidly compartmentalized, Army Special Forces operated within their own doctrines, and the Air Force had its own completely separate rescue squadrons.
It strikes me as well, trying to fight a massive, combined arms mechanized campaign without a central core headquarters to direct the traffic.
That's a great way to look at it.
Like, you might possess the absolute best heavy armor and the most elite motorized infantry on the planet, but if their communication networks are siloed and their commanders have never planned a joint maneuver, putting them on the same battlefield simultaneously is going to guarantee fratricide.
Or at least total operational chaos. Yeah, that is a perfect parallel. The operational friction of integrating distinct military branches for a single, highly complex, time-sensitive strike was just considered too high for the standard theater command structure in Vietnam.
Right, because General Creighton Abrams and MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, were completely consumed with the conventional war.
Exactly. Because of this, the intelligence bypassed the standard chain of command entirely. It went straight to the Pentagon's E-ring.
The outermost ring of the Pentagon, where the offices of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are located, so this bypasses the entire Pacific Theater Command.
It does. It lands right on the desk of General Earl Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and subsequently Admiral Thomas Moore. And Wheeler immediately commissioned a highly classified feasibility study.
Basically asking, could a force be inserted 23 miles from Hanoi, extract prisoners, and actually survive?
Right. And by mid-June, the study concluded it was technically feasible, but only if they built a bespoke, purpose-built task force from the ground up, operating entirely in the shadows.
So they tapped Brigadier General Leroy J. Manor, an Air Force veteran, to command the overall Joint Task Group. But for the actual ground assault, the man they chose to lead the raid was Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons.
A legendary figure.
Absolutely. Simons is a foundational figure in unconventional warfare. He isn't some polished staff officer. He's a rugged, profoundly experienced commando who cut his teeth in World War II and had spent years running covert cross-border operations in Laos.
Simons was really the archetype of the Special Forces commander. He understood fundamentally that this mission required men who could improvise violently in the dark.
So he handpicks his team.
Yeah, Simons and Manor recruited 56 Army Special Forces soldiers, Green Berets, and 62 Air Force personnel for what was initially codenamed Operation Ivory Coast.
And these weren't just random guys.
No, these were handpicked operators. They didn't just need good shooters. They needed men who could manage the extreme psychological load of a deep penetration rescue.
Right. But once you have the men, you need a laboratory to stress test your assault plan. Because you can't figure out how to breach an unknown fortress while you're taking fire.
Definitely not.
So the Joint Contingency Task Group relocated to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida to begin isolation and rehearsals. And the operational security measures they implemented down there are just fascinating.
The compartmentalization was absolute. Over the course of the late summer and fall, these operators conducted over 170 full-scale live fire rehearsals at Eglin.
170, that's insane repetition.
Yeah, they practice under different lunar illuminations, refining their infiltration angles, their radio brevity codes, their exact footwork. But for the vast majority of those rehearsals, the assaulters had zero idea what their actual target was.
They know they are training for a complex rescue, obviously. They're practicing breaching heavy doors and loading casualties onto helicopters in the dark. But they're completely blind to the geopolitical reality of the mission.
Right, they don't know they are going to North Vietnam.
So to bridge that gap, to allow them to plan without compromising the target, the CIA steps in with a remarkable piece of intelligence modeling.
They really did. The CIA constructed a highly detailed, incredibly accurate scale model of the Son Tay Prison compound, which they codenamed Barbara.
And this wasn't just a simple tabletop diorama, right?
Oh, no. Barbara was constructed using the precise dimensional data pulled from those SR-71 imagery passes. But its true value was a specialized, periscopic magnifying viewer attached to the model.
I read about this in Prichter's analysis. The planners could actually look through this periscope and simulate the exact ground-level sightlines.
Yes, exactly.
They could put the lens at the scale equivalent of a 6-foot-tall soldier standing in the courtyard and see exactly which guard towers had a line of sight into which cell blocks. It's brilliant.
It allowed them to calculate the geometry of the firefight before they ever loaded a magazine. And that geometry dictated the entire tactical approach.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, because as they used Barbara to map out the assault, the planners confronted a severe dilemma. Son Tay was a walled compound. If you land the assault force outside the walls, which is standard outside in assault doctrine, the operators have to disembark, maneuver to the perimeter, blow a breach in the heavy masonry, and then fight their way into the interior cell blocks.
And in a hostage rescue, the primary enemy isn't the guard force. It's time.
Always time.
If you spend 60 seconds breaching an external wall, you are giving the North Vietnamese guards 60 seconds to execute the prisoners. A perimeter assault guarantees you recover nothing but bodies.
Precisely. The outside-in approach was mathematically eliminated. They had to go inside out.
Meaning they land inside the walls.
Right. The primary assault element had to be dropped directly into the tiny central courtyard of the prison. The moment their boots hit the dirt, they needed to be within feet of the cell doors, neutralizing the guards instantly.
But looking at the SR-71 imagery, that courtyard is impossibly small. It is hemmed in by tall trees and multi-story brick administrative buildings. Now, the standard insertion platform for the Army at that time was the UH-1 Huey. But I imagine trying to thread a Huey into that courtyard under zero illumination is a nightmare.
Well, they attempted it during the rehearsals at Eglin, and the Huey failed the mission profile completely.
Really? Just too small.
It wasn't just the size of the courtyard. The Huey had a maximum capacity of roughly 11 heavily armed assaulters, which wasn't enough to secure the courtyard simultaneously. Furthermore, its fuel range was far too short to make the deep penetration flight into North Vietnam without a forward refueling point, which obviously didn't exist.
Right.
And critically, its top airspeed was simply too slow. It could not keep up with the fixed-wing C-130 aircraft that was required to guide the formation.
So the standard aviation asset is out. And this is where the sheer audacity of Operation Ivory Coast reveals itself. Mick Prichter's study highlights the radical alternative they devised. If you cannot safely fly a small helicopter into the courtyard, you take a massive helicopter and you accept the violent consequences.
Yeah, the planners selected the HH-3 Jolly Green Giant, which is a massive, heavy-lift search and rescue helicopter. Their solution was to take this aircraft designated Banana 1 and purposefully crash-land it into the center of the prison.
Let's talk about the physics of that for a moment.
Yeah.
They knew with absolute certainty that the rotor disc of the HH-3 was wider than the physical space between the trees and the buildings in that courtyard.
Oh, they knew.
They were actively writing the destruction of their own aircraft into the operational timeline. They knew the moment it descended below the tree line, the massive rotor blades would strike the masonry, shatter the timber, and the aircraft would violently tear itself apart as it hit the ground.
It was a one-way ticket. There was no flying it out. To mitigate the kinetic trauma of that intentional crash, the crew chiefs literally strapped mattresses to the floor of the helicopter cabin.
Mattresses.
Mattresses. The 13-man primary assault team would lie flat on those mattresses, brace themselves, and just ride out the violent deceleration of the aircraft chopping itself to pieces.
That is wild.
And the moment the fuselage stopped moving, they would sprint down the rear ramp and begin engaging targets.
That requires an absolute, unshakable trust in the aircrew. I mean, you are lying in the dark waiting for a localized car crash. And once they sprint out of that wreckage, they are relying on equipment that quartermasters had to scrounge from highly specialized sources. Prichter details the gear, and it really paints a grim picture of what they expected to find.
It does. They weren't just carrying standard M16 rifles, they were equipped for an industrial-level breach. The quartermasters procured commercial chainsaws, heavy machetes, massive bolt cutters, acetylene torches, and heavy crowbars.
Because of the chains.
Right. They knew the North Vietnamese utilized heavy iron chains and reinforced padlocks. They had to be able to cut through anything instantly.
I noticed in Prichter's study they also utilized early red dot sights. In 1970, that is practically science fiction to me. How did a 1970s red dot actually work?
It's pretty fascinating. They used a commercial sight called the single point. It wasn't a modern holographic projection like we see today. It was an occluded eye sight.
Meaning the tube is blocked.
Exactly. The shooter looks into a solid tube with one eye, seeing only a red dot generated by ambient light collected through a fiber optic dome, or a tritium insert for night use. Because the tube is solid, the brain superimposes that red dot onto the target seen by the other, open eye.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it allowed the assaulters to aim effectively in extreme low-light, close-quarters environments without trying to align traditional iron sights in the dark.
It gives them a split-second advantage in a gunfight. But beyond the ballistic equipment, the medical loadout they prepared reveals the horrifying reality of the POW situation.
The medical planning was vast and deeply sobering. They were preparing to extract up to 70 men who had suffered years of severe malnutrition, untreated broken bones, dysentery, and just systemic physical degradation.
They were ready for the worst.
They had to be. The medics carried heavy loads of intravenous fluids, advanced trauma dressings, and restraints. They had to prepare for mass casualties, not just from the inevitable firefight, but from the fragile medical state of the prisoners, many of whom might be too weak to even walk to the extraction helicopters.
Wow.
So the ground scheme of maneuver is locked in. You have the crash landing HH-3, the cutting torches, the medical triage plan. But having a brilliant tactical plan for the objective is meaningless if the Armada cannot penetrate the airspace.
Right. Getting there is half the battle.
They're staring down the most concentrated, lethal, integrated air defense network in the world. North Vietnam was blanketed by early warning radars, SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and MiG fighter interceptors.
Bypassing that network required a masterpiece of navigational engineering. First, the entire operation had to be conducted at night. The darkness was their primary armor against visually aimed anti-aircraft fire and MiG interceptors, which lacked advanced night fighting capabilities at the time.
But this imposes a severe constraint because aviation night vision goggles did not exist yet.
Exactly. The entire Armada was completely reliant on the specific phase of the moon, roughly a quarter moon, to provide just enough ambient light to maintain tight aircraft formations, but not so much light that the enemy ground spotters could easily track them.
The margin for error upon arriving at the target is practically non-existent, isn't it? Prichter emphasizes the operational mandate. They had to arrive over Son Tay and insert the force on the very first pass.
There was no go-around option.
Right. If the flight lead missed the compound by even a few miles, the noise of the massive helicopter formation banking around for a second attempt would wake the guard force. The element of surprise would vanish, and the prisoners would be executed.
To guarantee that absolute first-pass precision using 1970 avionics, the Air Force deployed an MC-130 Combat Talon. This is a massive, 4-engine specialized cargo plane. It acted as the flight lead, assigned the call sign Cherry 1.
And it had special gear.
Right. The Combat Talon was equipped with highly sophisticated terrain-following radar and an early form of forward-looking infrared, or FLIR.
The FLIR is critical here. It's not a camera. It's a sensor detecting thermal differentials. It allows the navigator in the MC-130 to basically see the temperature differences between the cold river waters and the warmer masonry of the prison walls in absolute darkness.
Exactly. Cherry 1's mission was to use those sensors to thread the needle through the mountain valleys, fly directly over the precise geographic coordinates of the prison, and drop powerful magnesium illumination flares to light up the courtyard for the trailing helicopters, who were flying essentially blind.
But this introduces a terrifying aerodynamic problem.
Okay.
You have a massive fixed-wing 4-engine cargo plane leading a formation of rotary-wing helicopters. An MC-130 is designed to cruise at hundreds of miles per hour. A heavy-lift helicopter, pushed to its absolute structural limits, maxes out at a fraction of that speed. How do you keep them tightly grouped in the dark?
The pilots were pushing the absolute margins of aviation physics. The MC-130 had to throttle back and fly at an extreme high angle of attack, essentially riding the edge of its stall speed.
That's incredibly dangerous.
It is. The stall warning horns in the cockpit would have been blaring constantly. If the pilots allowed the airspeed to drop even a few knots, the wings would lose lift and the massive cargo plane would drop out of the sky.
While simultaneously, the helicopter pilots behind them are redlining their engines, flying at their maximum possible velocity just to keep up, vibrating violently, risking retreating blade stall.
It was an aerodynamic tightrope. And to synchronize the arrival of this massive disparate force, they utilized complex dogleg navigation routing.
The raid force was nicknamed the Fruit Salad due to the call signs, correct?
Yes. The MC-130 flight leads were the cherries, the sacrificial HH-3 was banana, the massive HH-53 super jolly green giant extraction helicopters were the apples. The A-1E Styraider close air support attack planes, which are propeller-driven aircraft carrying heavy ordnance, were the peaches. And the high-altitude EC-121 radar surveillance aircraft were the frogs.
Because these aircraft all have drastically different cruise speeds and ranges, they couldn't just launch from the same runway at the same time.
No, the fast-moving fighters would overtake the slow helicopters instantly.
Right, so they launched from multiple separate air bases across Thailand and South Vietnam at staggered times. They flew specific, mathematically calculated vectors, the doglegs, timing their turns perfectly so that every single aircraft converged into a single formation over the mountains of Laos, arriving at the exact predetermined second.
But even a perfectly timed formation of loud aircraft will eventually trip a radar warning receiver. To prevent the North Vietnamese from launching MiGs to intercept them, the U.S. Navy executed one of the most brilliant diversionary operations of the war.
I find the Navy's role here absolutely fascinating. While the Special Forces are creeping in low over the Western Mountains, the Navy launches a massive strike package up to 60 carrier-based aircraft from Task Force 77 in the Gulf of Tonkin, heading straight for the coastal city of Haiphong on the eastern side of the country.
And this wasn't a bombing run, it was an electronic warfare masterclass. The Navy aircraft aggressively pushed toward the coast, dropping flares and dispersing massive clouds of radar-jamming chaff.
Let's define chaff for our listeners because it's a brilliant mechanic. They are ejecting millions of tiny strips of aluminum foil or metallized glass fiber into the airstream. Yeah. And these strips are cut to specific lengths that precisely match the wavelengths of the enemy's search radars.
Right, so when the radar beam hits that cloud of aluminum, the energy reflects back to the receiver, creating a massive, blooming false return on the enemy's cathode ray tubes. To the North Vietnamese radar operators staring at their screens, it looked exactly like a massive, multi-wave, heavy bomber strike was descending on Haiphong Harbor.
It's a gigantic electronic sleight of hand. They forced the entire North Vietnamese integrated air defense network to panic, activate all their eastern SAM sites, and launch their MiGs toward the coast, looking entirely in the wrong direction while the actual raid force slips through the back door.
The diversion was flawlessly executed. The planning, the rehearsals, the electronic warfare, the theory was complete. The time had come for execution. On November 18, 1970, President Richard Nixon was briefed on the final parameters and gave the formal executive approval. Operation Ivory Coast transitioned into its execution phase, Operation Kingpin.
Following the presidential green light, the ground assault force deployed to their forward staging base at the Royal Thai Air Force Base in Tak Ly. Up until this very moment, the vast majority of the operators still did not know the actual objective. They knew their tactics, but not the target.
It was finally time to pull the curtain back. At 1800 hours on November 20th, the men were gathered in a heavily secured briefing room at Tak Ly. Colonel Bull Simons stood at the front.
The moment of truth.
Exactly. He looked out at these men operators who had pushed themselves to the brink of physical failure for months and delivered the reveal. He told them, "We are going to rescue 70 Americans from a camp called Son Tay. This is something American prisoners have a right to expect from their country."
The psychological shift in that room must have been tectonic. They suddenly realize they aren't just hitting a high-value target or grabbing an intelligence asset. They are risking their lives specifically to bring their brothers in arms home. It crystallizes the entire endeavor.
It gave them absolute focus.
Shortly after that briefing, the final team rosters are verified, gear is checked one last time, and the Armada begins launching into the night sky.
By midnight, the infiltration is fully underway. The operation requires highly complex, dangerous in-flight refueling over the pitch-black mountains of northern Laos.
In the dark.
Yes. The helicopters, flying blind, have to maneuver their refueling probes into the small drogue baskets trailing behind the tanker aircraft. Any miscalculation in speed or altitude in the dark would result in a catastrophic mid-air collision.
Once they are topped off with fuel, the helicopter formation drops down onto the deck, flying below 1,000 feet above ground level. They're hugging the topography, using the karst mountains and deep valleys to physically block their radar signatures from the enemy's line of sight.
The tension inside those aircraft, specifically in the darkened cabin of Banana One with the assault team lying on mattresses, must have been suffocating. And then the assault phase initiates. The MC-130 Cherry 1 arrives perfectly on target. The navigator tracks the thermal signature of the compound. Cherry 1 drops massive illumination flares, turning the night sky over the prison into artificial daylight.
And it does something else too, right?
Right. Cherry 1 does something else highly specific. It drops firefight simulators to the south and southeast of the compound.
These aren't just loud firecrackers. These are sophisticated pyrotechnic devices designed to rapidly detonate and perfectly mimic the acoustic signature of a massive infantry engagement-heavy machine guns, rifle fire, grenade detonations.
The tactical intent was isolation. They wanted any local North Vietnamese quick reaction forces or military police in the surrounding villages to hear a massive battle erupting half a mile away from the prison, drawing their attention and their vehicles away from the actual breach point.
Brilliant misdirection.
But just as the flares ignite and the simulators go off, the meticulously rehearsed plan hits its first major friction point.
The navigation glitch.
Yeah. The helicopter flight lead is Apple III, an HH-53 Super Jolly Green Giant. Its job is to eliminate the guard towers. In the confusing, shifting shadows cast by the swinging parachute flares and disoriented by the sudden illumination, the pilots of Apple III drift roughly 300 yards south of their intended flight track.
Oh, no.
They look down and spot a walled compound that looks remarkably similar to their objective.
But the pilots of Apple III realize the visual geometry is wrong. They have spent hundreds of hours staring through the periscope of the Barbara model. They know the exact layout. There is no river tributary running along the eastern wall of the compound below them. The guard towers aren't in the correct corners. They quickly deduce they are looking at a secondary school facility located 400 yards south of the actual Son Tay Prison.
It's an incredible display of situational awareness under extreme stress. Apple III recognizes the drift instantly. They bank hard, correcting their course north towards the actual Son Tay compound. Banana One, the crash helicopter, and Apple II follow the correction. However, Apple I, the helicopter carrying Colonel Simons himself and the 22-man Greenleaf support group, misses the sudden course correction in the chaos of the flares.
Oh, they keep going.
Yeah, Apple I continues straight ahead on the initial vector and prepares to insert its assaulters right into the secondary school.
We are going to explore the chaos that erupts at the secondary school in just a moment because it is intense. But let's follow the primary assault force to the actual prison first. Apple III arrives over the correct target. Its primary mission is to suppress the external threats to allow Banana One to crash safely.
Apple III climbs slightly to clear the heavy tree canopy, and the aerial gunners open fire with three 7.62mm miniguns.
Those things are monsters.
They are. These are electrically driven, multi-barrel rotary weapons mounted in the left and right crew doors and on the rear ramp. The cyclic rate of a minigun is devastating. They are firing at 6,000 rounds per minute.
6,000.
That is 100 rounds of armor-piercing and tracer ammunition impacting the target every single second.
The physics of that firepower is terrifying. In a matter of seconds, Apple III effectively vaporizes the elevated guard towers and shreds the wooden guard barracks outside the walls, neutralizing the immediate perimeter threat. And the moment the miniguns cease firing, Banana One begins its terminal descent.
This is the critical moment. The Jolly Green Giant comes screaming in, flares its nose violently to bleed off airspeed, and deliberately drops into the tiny courtyard. Mick Prichter's analysis captures the sheer violence of the impact.
It must have been deafening.
Oh, absolutely. The massive rotor blades act like giant scythes, violently chopping through thick jungle timber, striking the heavy brick administrative buildings, and shattering roof tiles. The courtyard is showered with razor-sharp wooden splinters, brick shrapnel, and the tearing metal of the helicopter itself as it violently crushes its own landing gear and slams into the earth.
Inside the cabin, it's a localized earthquake. During the impact, one of the crewmen, Technical Sergeant Leroy Wright, is struck by a heavy fire extinguisher that actually tears loose from the bulkhead due to the massive deceleration forces. He suffers a severely fractured ankle.
That was one of the only injuries, miraculously.
Right. But despite the concussive trauma of the crash, the 13-man Blue Boy assault group, who had been riding out the impact on those mattresses, instantly explode out of the mangled fuselage.
The leader of the Blue Boy group is Captain Dick Meadows, another legendary figure in Special Forces history. Meadows hits the ground in the flare-lit courtyard with a portable bullhorn. He is shouting over the deafening noise of the dying turbine engines and the crackle of gunfire. "We are Americans! Keep your head down! This is a rescue! Get on the floor!"
The assaulters immediately fan out. Their rules of engagement are absolute and uncompromising. Rapidly clear the cells, extract the prisoners, and immediately neutralize any armed individual they encounter. They are a rescue force, not a capture force. They do not have the time or the manpower to take North Vietnamese prisoners.
While Blue Boy is violently kicking open doors and clearing the internal cell blocks with those cutting torches and bolt cutters, the Red Wine Group, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Elliot Sidner, arrives in Apple II.
Where do they land?
They land just outside the southern wall of the compound. Red Wine rapidly deploys and pushes out to secure the outer perimeter. Their primary objective is to isolate the battlefield, securing nearby administrative buildings and a crucial canal bridge to the south.
To hold off reinforcements.
Exactly. They must prevent any localized North Vietnamese reinforcements from driving down the road and engaging the extraction helicopters. It is during this aggressive perimeter clearance that First Sergeant Joseph Murray is struck in the thigh by enemy fire while securing a building.
So the tactical picture. Blue Boy is tearing through the inside of the prison. Red Wine is holding the southern exterior. But they are missing a massive element of their combat power. The plan fundamentally relied on the 22-man Greenleaf group to secure the eastern perimeter, block the main road, and destroy a major river bridge to halt any mechanized response from Hanoi. But Greenleaf isn't there, because Apple I missed the turn.
Right. Apple I has touched down at the secondary school 400 yards away. Colonel Bull Simons and the Greenleaf assaulters rush down the rear ramp, ready to secure the eastern flank of the prison. But within seconds of hitting the dirt, the experienced operators realize the geography is entirely wrong.
It doesn't look like Barbara.
The buildings don't match the Barbara model at all, and infinitely worse. The secondary school is not an abandoned facility. It is actively garrisoned by hundreds of heavily armed North Vietnamese soldiers.
A massive point-blank firefight instantly detonates. Greenleaf is completely exposed, taking heavy automatic weapons fire from the school buildings. This is the moment where an operation falls apart, where the friction of war destroys the plan.
Usually, yes.
But this is also where the genius of those 170 rehearsals at Eglin pays off. Colonel Simons doesn't freeze. He instantly assesses the tactical geometry, gets on his radio, and triggers Contingency Plan Green.
Contingency Plan Green was a pre-briefed audible. It dictates that if the Greenleaf group is compromised or delayed, the Red Wine group, who is currently heavily engaged securing the southern bridge at the actual prison, must immediately flex.
They have to cover the gap.
Right. Red Wine has to organically expand their sector of fire, taking over all of Greenleaf's assigned objective, effectively stretching their own defensive lines dangerously thin to cover the gap and protect the extraction zone.
But Simons still has to get his men out of a massive gunfight. He orders the pilot of Apple I, who had just lifted off after dropping them, to immediately fly back down into the hot landing zone.
The pilot of Apple I dives back into the tracer fire. Simon's men conduct a rapid fighting withdrawal, load back onto the ramp while actively returning fire, and Apple I lifts off, ferrying them 400 yards up the road to drop them at the correct target.
Consider the discipline required for that maneuver. It is like a seasoned airborne infantry commander jumping into the dark, hitting the ground under fire, realizing the wind has blown his entire company to the wrong drop zone, and instantly restructuring his entire assault matrix while actively dodging heavy machine gun fire.
It's pure tactical flexibility.
Within minutes, Greenleaf is extracted, inserted at the correct zone, and fans out to secure their original objectives. The task force absorbs the friction and becomes whole again.
The tactical execution is breathtaking. Despite the crash, the navigation error, and the intense firefight, the perimeter is now absolutely locked down. The enemy guard force within the compound has been systematically neutralized. Blue Boy and Red Wine teams are moving methodically with absolute precision through every single cell, every barracks room, and every administrative building inside the compound.
They are clearing the fatal funnels, shouting for Americans.
But as the cordite smoke begins to clear from the courtyard, a devastating reality begins to set in.
This is the horrifying pivot point of the Son Tay Raid. The raiders are clearing the dark rooms, searching for the emaciated forms of their countrymen. But the tactical radio network, which should have been alive with frantic reports of recovered POWs and medical triage updates, begins to carry a chilling, repetitive phrase. Over and over, team leaders key their microphones and report to the command post. Negative items.
Negative items. The pre-briefed operational code phrase meaning no prisoners found. They clear the primary cell blocks. Negative items. They breach the isolation cells. Negative items. Finally, Captain Dick Meadows, standing in the debris-strewn heart of the compound they had just risked everything to penetrate, keys his handset and delivers the final, crushing report to the overhead command aircraft. Search complete. Negative items.
The POWs are gone. The camp is empty. I cannot begin to fathom the emotional whiplash those operators experienced in that courtyard. You have spent months isolating yourselves from the world, preparing to save your brothers. You have flown through the teeth of the most lethal air defense network on Earth. You intentionally crashed a multi-million-dollar helicopter. You fought a pitch-black, point-blank firefight, and the prize simply isn't there.
The psychological blow must have been immense, but what is truly remarkable, what cements this as a masterclass in special operations, is the absolute discipline of the task force in that exact moment.
They don't fall apart.
There is no time for confusion. There is no time to mourn the failure of the objective. They are deep inside North Vietnam. They have just kicked a massive hornet's nest, and the enemy is undoubtedly mobilizing a massive mechanized response from Hanoi. Colonel Simons does not hesitate. He immediately orders the extraction phase to begin.
They execute the withdrawal with the exact same ruthless mechanical efficiency as the assault. Dick Meadows and a small demolitions team rigged the wrecked carcass of Banana 1 with highly specialized thermite and explosive charges. They cannot allow the North Vietnamese or their Soviet advisors to recover the advanced secure radios and avionics from the helicopter. They blow it to pieces.
The massive HH-53 extraction helicopters, Apple 1 and Apple 2, swoop back in from their holding orbits. The assault teams conduct a perfectly phased withdrawal, bounding back toward the landing zones while maintaining their perimeter security until the very last possible moment.
And they get everyone out.
They load their wounded, incredibly, just 2 men, Sergeant Wright with the broken ankle from the crash, and First Sergeant Murray with the gunshot wound to the leg.
The timeline Prichter lays out for the ground operation is staggering.
Right.
From the exact moment Banana 1 violently crash-landed into the courtyard to the moment the last assaulter was re-embarked onto the extraction helicopters, exactly 27 minutes had passed.
That's incredibly fast.
27 minutes of perfectly orchestrated, ultra-violent chaos. 25 men loaded onto Apple 1 and 34 onto Apple 2. The platoon leaders execute frantic head counts, double-checking and triple-checking in the dark. Everyone is accounted for. The helicopters lift off, transitioning to forward flight, and begin the long, incredibly dangerous flight back to the border.
And that withdrawal was not without severe friction. As the Armada retreated westward toward the Laotian border, the North Vietnamese Integrated Air Defense Network, now fully awake, furious, and tracking the massive radar signatures, began filling the night sky with SA-2 surface-to-air missiles.
They're shooting at everything now.
Right. During this massive SAM barrage, an Air Force F-105G Wild Weasel was struck and shot down over northern Laos.
Now, the Wild Weasels are a fascinating subculture of aviation. Their entire job is to intentionally fly into the engagement envelopes of enemy SAM sites, baiting the radar operators into turning on their targeting radars.
Exactly. The Wild Weasel acts as bait. The moment the enemy radar illuminates them, the Wild Weasel fires an anti-radiation missile that rides the enemy's own radar beam directly back to the transmitter to destroy it. But it is an incredibly dangerous game of chicken. And on this night, Firebird 5, providing cover for the retreating helicopters, took a hit.
The Raid Force actually briefly considered diverting the massive extraction helicopters to immediately rescue the downed crew of Firebird 5. But the command aircraft deemed a nighttime rescue of 2 pilots in the steep, jagged karst terrain of Laos too hazardous for helicopters already loaded with the entire assault force. The downed crew had to evade and survive the night in the jungle.
Which they did, thankfully.
Yes, at dawn, dedicated extraction helicopters, Apple 4 and Apple 5, pushed back into Laos and successfully rescued the downed pilots. By mid-morning on November 21st, every single aircraft, save for Firebird 5, and every single raider was safely back at secure bases in Thailand.
The task force survived. The tactical execution of the breach, the contingency planning, the extraction, it was virtually flawless. But that brings us to the ultimate painful question of this entire operation. The mission failed its primary goal. The cells were empty.
Yeah, how does a military apparatus launch an operation of this magnitude without knowing the target is abandoned?
Mhm.
What does this mean for the historical legacy of the raid?
To understand that, we have to analyze the intelligence gap, because to the layman, it seems impossible. We have SR-71s taking photos of laundry signals. We have the CIA building scale models. How does the intelligence fail this spectacularly?
What's fascinating here is how this operation exposes the profound systemic flaws in the U.S. intelligence architecture of the 1970s. Mick Prichter's study extensively details how the U.S. intelligence community was heavily, destructively compartmentalized.
Right. There were massive physical, cultural, and procedural barriers that actively prevented vital information from flowing between agencies.
It's the classic fatal bureaucratic silo problem. The CIA has a piece of the puzzle, the Defense Intelligence Agency has another, the National Security Agency has signals intercepts, but they refuse to integrate that data.
And the reasons for that siloing are deeply ingrained in the bureaucracy. It's about protecting sensitive human sources. It's about classification clearances. But often it was simply about interagency rivalry and competing for operational budget.
Just protecting their turf.
Exactly. Prichter notes that relevant information indicating the prisoners had been moved may have actually been known to certain individuals within the broader intelligence community, but due to the hyper-classified need-to-know nature of Operation Ivory Coast, that intelligence was never passed to the specific raid planners who desperately needed to know it.
Which is tragic.
Current historical consensus, pieced together long after the war, suggests the POWs may have been moved out of Son Tay as early as July of 1970.
Wait, July? The raid launched in late November. If the prisoners were moved months prior, why did the mission still get a green light? Surely the Blackbirds were still flying reconnaissance.
They were, and this is where the deeply human flaw of confirmation bias infects the planning process. By late October and early November, there were subtle but significant intelligence indicators. Changes in the daily activity patterns at the camp, a lack of new ground signals that suggested the camp might be empty. But the planners and the high-level decision-makers were victims of operational momentum.
They had already spent millions of dollars. They had built the bespoke task force, the men had trained for months to the point of exhaustion, and they had secured the approval of the President of the United States. The massive machine was in motion. Stopping it would require immense political courage.
Yes. Subconsciously, or perhaps even consciously to preserve the mission, analysts began selectively interpreting the ambiguous intelligence to support the conclusion they desperately wanted, that the prisoners were still there.
They saw what they wanted to see.
The closer they got to the execution date, the greater the bureaucratic and psychological resistance to canceling the mission became. In their minds, it was simply too big and too important to fail.
So what does this all mean? It is a devastating textbook case study in intelligence failure. But when modern military academies, places like West Point or the Army War College, evaluate the Son Tay Raid today, they do not merely teach it as a failure. They actively contrast the strategic intelligence failure with the immense tactical success.
Because tactically, the raid proved that the seemingly impossible was, in fact, achievable. It proved that highly specialized forces from the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force could integrate effectively in a high-threat, non-permissive environment.
They validated incredibly complex theoretical concepts.
Right, like night visionless, low-level navigation, the viability of intentional crash insertions for rapid breaching, and the effectiveness of massive joint force electronic deception operations.
The hard, painful lessons learned in the darkness over Son Tay directly set the groundwork for the creation of the modern special operations infrastructure. The eventual creation of JSOC years later owes a massive, unpayable debt to the tactical groundwork laid by Bull Simons and his men.
Absolutely.
But that still leaves a massive, lingering historical question. Where were the prisoners? If they weren't in Son Tay, where did the North Vietnamese take them? And what was all that activity the spy planes kept seeing in the courtyard leading up to November?
Well, the North Vietnamese had made a broad strategic decision to consolidate their American prisoners into fewer, much larger, heavily centralized camps closer to the center of Hanoi, most notably the infamous Hoa Lo prison, colloquially known as the Hanoi Hilton. And there's a fascinating historical rumor which emerged from the POWs themselves years later regarding why the Son Tay prisoners specifically were moved.
What was the rumor?
The rumor suggests the American prisoners at Son Tay had bravely and stubbornly insisted on holding separate Catholic and Protestant religious services.
Wait, I need to make sure I understand this. You have men being actively starved, beaten, and kept in isolation, and they are demanding religious freedom from their captors.
They did. It was a profound act of resistance. And the North Vietnamese camp authorities, wanting to avoid international scrutiny from visiting foreign delegations, and perhaps thinking it would simply be easier to manage the prisoners in a purpose-built facility, decided that moving them to a larger, centralized prison closer to the capital would accommodate this and look better for propaganda purposes. So they moved them out.
But what about the SR-71 photos? The intelligence analysts saw people moving in the compound in November.
What the analysts were seeing was a deception of circumstance. After moving the POWs, the North Vietnamese had simply repurposed the empty Son Tay Prison into a logistics and training hub for their own troops. The daily movement of North Vietnamese soldiers and supply trucks in and out of the compound mimicked the physical patterns of a functioning prison just enough to fool the intelligence analysts looking at shadows from 80,000 feet.
It is a tragic, bitter irony. But there is a final, incredibly profound twist to this paradox. The raid failed to bring a single man home that night. But in the long run, looking at the macro-level history of the Vietnam War, the Son Tay Raid actually worked.
It did. If we connect this specific tactical event to the broader strategic picture of the POW experience, the impact of the raid was profoundly positive. When the North Vietnamese High Command in Hanoi realized what had actually happened, that an elite American assault force had penetrated just 23 miles from their capital city, utterly destroyed a military compound, neutralized a guard force, and vanished into the night without taking a single fatality, they were deeply embarrassed and fundamentally terrified.
They suddenly realized that nowhere in the country was safe. The Americans could reach out and touch them anywhere at any time.
Precisely. In sheer panic, fearing subsequent raids, the North Vietnamese immediately accelerated the consolidation of all remaining outlying POW camps. They moved almost every American prisoner into large, heavily guarded facilities in the immediate center of Hanoi. And while being moved to a heavily guarded prison sounds detrimental, it was actually the absolute best thing that could have happened to the American prisoners.
Because in the small, isolated jungle camps like Son Tay, the guards operated with total impunity. They could torture, starve, and isolate prisoners without any oversight. But in the large, centralized camps in Hanoi, the prisoners were finally brought together.
They were no longer in solitary confinement. They could tap on the walls. They could communicate. They established an organized, covert chain of command. They could support each other psychologically and share medical knowledge.
That human connection is everything.
The American POWs universally reported a significant, immediate improvement in their treatment, their food rations, and their medical care after they were consolidated. Furthermore, when the prisoners found out through the whispered camp grapevine that the United States military had actually sent a massive commando force deep into enemy territory, risking dozens of aircraft just to try and bring them home, their morale absolutely skyrocketed.
They realized they hadn't been forgotten by their country. The raiders didn't physically put them on a helicopter that night, but they delivered the hope required to survive. That is an incredible, enduring legacy.
It really is.
And that legacy brings us directly back to the present day. When Mick Prichter conducted his deep terrain analysis and battlefield travel in April of 2025, he visited the actual physical site of the Son Tay prison compound.
And what he documented is a stark, almost melancholy reminder of how quickly the physical remnants of history can be swallowed by time and nature. The site is not preserved. It is not an official monument. The vast majority of the brick buildings, the guard barracks, and the perimeter walls are just scattered rubble now. The entire area is heavily overgrown with dense jungle vegetation, surrounded by privately owned residential land and modern farmland.
Prichter notes in his research that only one original structure remains standing today, the main prisoner barracks, which the raid planners had designated as Objective 5B. And it is in a state of severe, crumbling dilapidation. It's a ghost. A quiet, decaying ruin, hiding the violent echoes of chainsaws, miniguns, and a crashing Jolly Green Giant.
It is a profound, lingering image. But the story doesn't actually end at that ruin, because the legacy of the Son Tay Raiders, and specifically of the men who commanded it, didn't end in the jungles of Southeast Asia.
No, it didn't. And this is an addendum to the history that feels like it was ripped straight from a Hollywood thriller. We have to talk about Ross Perot.
The billionaire.
Yeah, the American billionaire businessman. The founder of electronic data systems, who later ran for president in the 1990s. During the Vietnam War, Perot was an incredibly vocal, fiercely dedicated, and deep-pocketed advocate for the American POWs. He privately funded support activities, chartered planes to deliver supplies, drew international attention to their plight, and relentlessly pressured the U.S. government to act.
When the POWs finally returned home during Operation Homecoming in 1973, it was Ross Perot who funded and hosted a massive, emotional welcome home parade for them in San Francisco. And during that parade, Perot made absolutely sure that Colonel Arthur Bull Simons and the men of the Son Tay Raid were brought out onto the stage and publicly honored by the POWs for what they had attempted to do.
He knew what they rest.
He did. Perot formed a deep, abiding respect for the operational capability of those specific men.
Fast forward a few years to 1979. The geopolitical landscape has shifted. The Iranian Revolution is erupting. Absolute chaos is sweeping through the streets of Tehran. And amidst the violent overthrow of the government, two of Ross Perot's EDS corporate executives are arrested by revolutionary factions and thrown into a heavily guarded Iranian prison without formal charges. The U.S. government is paralyzed. Diplomatic channels are failing completely.
So, consider the scenario. What does a billionaire with infinite financial resources, a profound distrust of standard government bureaucracy, and two of his men trapped in a foreign prison do? He decides to mount his own privately funded rescue operation. But he doesn't hire a standard private security firm. He picks up the phone and calls a retired Army colonel who knows exactly, fundamentally, how to breach a foreign prison.
He hires Bull Simons, the ground commander of the Son Tay Raid. Simons comes out of retirement, puts together a private team of former operators, infiltrates into revolutionary Iran, orchestrates a complex prison break, and successfully smuggles the two EDS employees across the heavily guarded border into Turkey to safety.
It is an incredible, almost unbelievable testament to the enduring real-world capability of these specific men. They were forged in the highly classified crucible of Operation Ivory Coast, and the tactical brilliance and sheer operational audacity they developed in those rehearsals at Eglin echoed for decades across different continents.
To wrap up this massive exploration, we want to explicitly remind you that the incredible granular details, the timeline, the tactical analysis, and the on-the-ground 2025 site exploration we discussed today all stem directly from the exceptional primary source research of Mick Prichter.
His work on this specific engagement is definitive. The level of detail on his site is exactly what a thorough historical analysis requires.
We strongly encourage you to visit battlefieldtravels.com. Not only can you read his full, comprehensive study on the Son Tay Raid, but you can also view his exclusive 360-degree photos and video footage from his 2025 visit to the ruins of the prison compound. It is a true treasure trove of military history, featuring hundreds of other meticulously researched battle and campaign studies that will fundamentally change how you view these historical events.
It provides the context that transforms a date in a textbook into a living, breathing, tactical reality.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark skies over North Vietnam. It has been a privilege to unpack this complex, paradoxical slice of history with you. But as we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time analyzing how the empty cells at Son Tay were a colossal, systemic intelligence failure. But imagine just for a moment the alternative. Imagine if the U.S. intelligence bureaucracy had actually worked perfectly.
Right, if they had known.
Yeah. Imagine if the analysts had definitively proven in late October that the camp was empty and the massive mission had been quietly canceled in the Pentagon before it ever launched.
The POWs would still have been moved to Hanoi, but they never would have heard the whispered rumors of the rescue attempt.
The North Vietnamese High Command never would have been terrified into consolidating the camps and improving the conditions. And the men who eventually formed JSOs never would have learned the brutal, necessary lessons of joint operations in the dark. In the unforgiving calculus of war, is it possible that the greatest tactical failure of the Vietnam War was actually the precise, necessary catalyst required to save the men it set out to rescue?
Wow.
Think about that. We will see you on the next Deep Dive.